bribery involves the conditioning of an official act for something of value. An official act may be a White House meeting. An official act may be $400 million in military aid. And something of value to a president might include investigations of their political rival. It will be our job to decide whether the impeachable act of bribery has occurred.
Welcome to the Journal Editorial Report. I'm Paul Gigot. That was Democratic Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff Tuesday, kicking off a second week of public impeachment hearings. 9 witnesses testified over 3 days this week, including U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, Gordon Sondland. So did any of them offer proof that President Trump committed bribery or any other crime? Let's ask Robert Ray. He is former federal prosecutor and served as independent counsel in the Whitewater investigation. So welcome. Great to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's take this legal question and start with the assertion of alleged crimes and start with bribery. What do you think of Chairman Schiff's definition of bribery in this context?
I suppose he's right if you accept the Gerald Ford famous definition of an impeachable offense. That is whatever a majority of the members of the House of Representatives decide what it is. But, you know,
that's a political judgment.
That's a political judgment, but it also ignores history and the Constitution. You know, let's start with the constitutional language, which is where we should start. A president or any public official cannot be impeached unless a determination is made by the impeaching authority, which would be the House,
right,
that treason, bribery, or other high crime or misdemeanor has been committed.
But the only one of those that is defined in the Constitution, as I read it, is treason.
Correct.
So bribery, they're now using bribery all the time.
Yeah, but that can't be untethered from what the founders understood bribery to be, which was at least common law bribery. And the founders also were not unmindful of the fact that they were creating a Constitution, after all, which had a Congress which had the authority to pass laws, including a federal bribery statute.
Okay, but we have a current bribery statute.
We do.
So does what the president did on the evidence so far qualify as bribery under that statute?
Let's start with the statute. Whoever, being a public official, corruptly demands or seeks personally anything of value in return for being influenced in the performance of an official act. That's the bribery statute.
Okay.
So
why doesn't this qualify? Schiff says it does.
Well, first question is in the context of what they allege, which is any illegal foreign campaign contribution, that being the benefit derived to Donald Trump personally of the announcement in a press conference of investigations in Ukraine regarding the 2016 election, Burisma, and the Bidens. The Department of Justice has already opined through the Criminal Division and the Office of Public Integrity that something as nebulous as an investigation is not of sufficient concrete value to constitute something of value under the federal campaign finance laws. And the argument would be similarly under the federal bribery statute. So that's the first problem. Okay. Second problem is Adam Schiff has tried to tie it initially, based upon the testimony, to what the ask was for. And that was, according to him and the witnesses, not much more than a meeting at the White House.
Right.
Well, if it's a meeting, and you heard the piece that you just ran from Adam Schiff is trying to make the argument to the American people that a mere meeting at the White House is sufficient to constitute an official act. Answer to that question, wrong. The Supreme Court in the decision which involved the former governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia, Bob McDonnell, said a meeting without more does not constitute an official act.
Well, what about the delivery of military aid? The claim that it was withheld in order to extort this as a quid pro quo act.
And that's their other position. But of course, that's more difficult when you look at actually what the testimony was, because the best that you got from Ambassador Sondland, Fiona Hill, and several others is essentially that they presumed or assumed or it was implied that there was a linkage between investigations and foreign military assistance.
You don't think that's been proved?
Well, presumed and assumed and implied is not really worth much more than what you think, which is that's not proof that a crime was committed.
If the president said to somebody, look, we're not going to give these guys aid unless I see them investigate Joe and Hunter Biden, Would that be, in your view, something that could qualify as potentially a criminal act?
That would potentially be so, because that's really the difference between an actual demand as opposed to what was expressed here in the call, and also the benefit of the exculpatory information that we got this week from Ambassador Sondland, where the president said, listen, I don't want anything from Ukraine. I want them to do what it is. I want the president of Ukraine to do what he said he ran on, which was to root out corruption.
He explicitly said, I don't want a quid pro quo, according to Sondland at one instance.
Correct. And that's exculpatory, and that's not insignificant. Second thing is that Lieutenant Colonel Vindman also testified, listen, I, as a military officer, when I am in the chain of command, when the president asks or makes a request, I assume that that's an order. Well, that's true in connection with, military people being in the chain of command. Last I checked, President Zelensky was not in the military chain of command of the United States. So equating a request with a demand, which would be what would be required in order to prove an explicit quid pro quo that would constitute corrupt intent, that's not the same thing. And I think that they've fallen well short of the mark.
All right, we have a little time left. They're also moving, looks to me, to be putting together an article of impeachment on obstruction of Congress, because the president is saying that John Bolton and Charlie Kupperman and others can't testify.
Paul, I think that's the weakest, and it's not just that it's one thing that Bob Ray says it's the weakest. History says that that's the weakest. I mean, we've lived through other presidential impeachments, and in the Nixon case, as well as in the case involving former President Bill Clinton, you can make that contention, but it's a weak one. Why is it weak? Because there are legitimate reasons for a president on the basis of privilege to withhold information from the Congress. Where does that privilege derive? Executive privilege or presidential privilege? It derives from separation of powers. That's a battle between the branches, between the executive branch and the legislative branch. And there are reasons why a president, because of the sanctity of conversations and the confidentiality necessary to do your job, why you would want to protect those conversations from being disclosed to another branch of government. To try to turn that into abuse of office or a contempt of Congress is ridiculous, because the question is whether those claims of privilege are legitimate, and the only place to ultimately settle that, if push comes to shove, is before a court. And the Democrats have decided to forego that.
Yeah,
so
they decided not to contest those. All right, Robert Ray, thank you very much. Very illuminating. Appreciate it.